What if that feeling that something's missing has nothing to do with your relationships, your career, or anything outside you? I'm Jeff. This is Gnostic Archive, and today we're going into the most suppressed ritual in the Gnostic tradition, the Bridal Chamber. Stay with me.
There's a feeling most people carry and almost never name directly. Not sadness exactly, not loneliness exactly, something quieter and more persistent underneath both of those. A low-grade sense that some part of you got separated from another part somewhere along the way, and you've been walking around incomplete ever since, without quite being able to say what's missing. Modern life gives you a dozen explanations for that feeling. Find the right partner, build the right career, buy the right things. None of them ever actually resolve it, because according to one of the most suppressed rituals recovered from the entire Nag Hammadi library, none of them were ever addressing the actual separation in the first place. It's called the Bridal Chamber, and the Gospel of Philip treats it as the single most important sacrament in the entire Valentinian tradition, more central than baptism, more central than the Eucharist, and it isn't about marriage in the way you're picturing it. It's about something the institutional church found so threatening that references to it were systematically stripped from the surviving textual record almost everywhere except this one battered manuscript that happened to survive the purge. I'm Jeff, and this is Gnostic Archive. And today, we're going into the Bridal Chamber, what it actually was, why the Valentinian communities considered it the culmination of the entire spiritual path, and what it might explain about that persistent sense of incompleteness so many people carry without ever understanding where it comes from. Let's start with the text itself, because the Gospel of Philip isn't structured like a narrative gospel at all. It reads more like a collection of theological aphorisms and reflections, gathered and arranged by a Valentinian teacher or community sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century, recovered along with the rest of the Nag Hammadi library in that sealed jar in 1945. Unlike the Gospel of Thomas, which presents itself as a direct list of sayings from Jesus, Philip reads more like commentary, a community working out the implications of ideas already in circulation, referencing sacraments, rituals, and cosmological structures, as though the reader is already assumed to have some familiarity with them. And scattered throughout this text are references to 5 sacraments the Valentinian communities practiced: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and the Bridal Chamber, with the Bridal Chamber consistently treated as the highest of the 5, the one the others were building toward. The text states directly that the Bridal Chamber is not for animals, meaning it isn't accessible to those still operating from purely instinctual, unreflective consciousness, and it isn't for slaves, meaning those still bound entirely to external authority rather than internal recognition. It's reserved, the text says, for free men and virgins, language that has confused readers for a very long time, until you understand what those terms actually meant inside this cosmological framework. It's worth pausing on why a sacramental system built around 5 distinct stages would have existed at all, because it tells you something about how the Valentinian communities understood spiritual development not as a single event, but as a structured progression. Baptism, in their framework, addressed the initial cleansing and entry into the community. Chrism, an anointing rite, addressed a further deepening of recognition. The Eucharist addressed ongoing communal nourishment in that recognition. Redemption addressed a specific ritual concerned with safe passage through exactly the kind of archontic checkpoints we've discussed in relation to the Pistis Sophia material. And the Bridal Chamber sat at the summit of all of it, not because the other 4 were unimportant, but because they were understood as preparatory, each one addressing a different layer of the separation, until the initiate was actually ready for the final reunion the entire system was oriented toward. This wasn't casual theology. It was an entire developmental architecture, built with the same seriousness and internal consistency modern people associate with structured meditation or therapeutic frameworks, except constructed 2,000 years earlier and nearly erased entirely. Here's the cosmology underneath it, and this connects directly to material we've covered extensively on this channel. According to the Apocryphon of John and related Valentinian sources, the original state of the pleroma, the fullness, involved paired emanations, aeons that existed in balanced, complementary relationship with one another. Sophia's fall, the event that ultimately produces the material world and the demiurge, happens specifically because she acts alone, without her paired consort, generating something outside the balanced structure the pleroma depends on. The separation that produces the flawed material world isn't fundamentally about matter versus spirit in this reading. It's about isolation versus union, about a single aeon acting cut off from its complementary pairing and producing something incomplete as a direct result. If that's the cosmological wound at the root of the entire system, then the bridal chamber isn't a wedding ceremony in any conventional sense. It's a ritual enactment of exactly the reunion the pleroma itself needs restored. The Gospel of Philip states this almost as directly as ancient religious language allows, describing how in the beginning, before separation, there was a single, undivided unity, and the entire drama of the material world, the reason death and division exist at all, traces back to that original splitting. The text uses the image of Eve being separated from Adam as its central metaphor, treating that separation, rather than any subsequent act, as the actual origin point of death entering the world. Death, in this reading, isn't a punishment for disobedience. It's the direct, structural consequence of division itself. And if division is the wound, reunion is the only possible medicine. This reframing of the Adam and Eve narrative deserves its own moment of attention because it represents one of the sharpest breaks with mainstream theology anywhere in the Valentinian material. Institutional Christianity built an entire doctrine of original sin around that story, locating humanity's fundamental problem in disobedience, in a specific transgressive act requiring atonement administered through institutional sacrament. The Gospel of Philip relocates the fundamental problem to a point earlier in the story, to the separation itself, before any act of disobedience was even possible. If the wound precedes the sin, then the entire theological architecture built around guilt, transgression, and institutionally administered atonement is addressing the wrong injury. You cannot repent your way out of a structural division. You can only recognize your way through it, and recognition, unlike repentance, was never something an institution could fully administer on someone else's behalf. This is where I think the ritual gets genuinely radical, and where it starts explaining that background feeling of incompleteness so many people carry. The Gospel of Philip describes the bridal chamber not primarily as a union between two separate human beings, though some scholarly readings do treat it as involving an actual ritual enactment between initiates, but more fundamentally, as the reunion of a person's earthly, embodied self with what the text calls their angelic counterpart, their higher self, the aspect of them that remained whole in the pleroma, even while a portion of them descended into matter. The text describes this using language of images and reflections meeting their original, of a person finally encountering not another separate being, but the completed version of what they already were before the fall into division occurred. Read that carefully, because it reframes the entire feeling of missing something as not being about finding an external person to complete you. It's about recognizing an internal reunion that was always available, always waiting, and that romantic and sexual union, in the Valentinian framework, functioned as a physical metaphor pointing toward that deeper internal reconciliation, not as the actual mechanism accomplishing it. The Gospel of Philip is explicit that the earthly bridal chamber, the literal marriage relationship most people understand the term to mean, is described as an image of the true bridal chamber, a copy pointing toward the real reunion, which is internal, which is the reintegration of the fragmented self with its own wholeness. This matters enormously for anyone who has ever felt that persistent low-grade sense of incompleteness while simultaneously being in a stable relationship surrounded by people materially secure. If the actual separation the tradition is describing was never about a missing external partner, then no external partner, however genuinely loved, was ever going to fully resolve it. The Gospel of Philip is essentially arguing that an entire category of longing gets misdirected outward toward romantic and social fulfillment when its actual object was always internal reunion, the reintegration of a self that experienced itself as divided. Now, why would this be dangerous enough to require suppression when the language of union and marriage sounds, on the surface, compatible enough with mainstream Christian marriage theology? Here's the actual threat, and it's structural rather than merely thematic. If the highest sacrament in a religious tradition is an internal reunion each individual accomplishes through their own recognition, requiring no priest to officiate, no institution to certify, no external authority to declare the union valid, then the entire economy of institutional religious control around marriage, sacrament, and salvation collapses at its foundation. The developing institutional church needed sacraments to be things the church administered, validated, and could withhold. A sacrament accomplished internally through direct gnosis, available to anyone capable of the recognition, regardless of institutional standing, was structurally incompatible with a religious hierarchy that needed to remain necessary. There's a passage in the Gospel of Philip that states this almost bluntly, describing how those who have received the bridal chamber cannot be seen or detained by the archontic powers, using language nearly identical to what we've covered in the Pistis Sophia material about souls navigating past archonic checkpoints after death. The bridal chamber in this reading isn't only about resolving a psychological or emotional sense of incompleteness. It's described as producing an actual change in the initiate's standing relative to the powers that govern the material world, rendering them somehow illegible to forces that depend on incompleteness and division to maintain their grip. Think about what it would mean for an institution to preserve a text making that claim, while also trying to build a religious authority structure premised on believers remaining perpetually dependent, perpetually incomplete, perpetually in need of ongoing institutional mediation to manage their relationship with the divine. A sacrament that renders a person illegible to controlling powers, achieved through internal recognition rather than institutional administration, is not a sacrament any developing religious hierarchy could afford to let stand unchallenged. It doesn't just compete with institutional authority. It describes a state that makes institutional authority structurally unnecessary for the person who has received it. That's a different order of threat than simple doctrinal disagreement, and it explains why so little of this specific sacramental tradition survived anywhere outside this one damaged manuscript. I spent considerable time working through the different scholarly interpretations of what this ritual actually involved in practice, because the text is frustratingly indirect about specific procedure, likely deliberately so, given that Philip itself warns elsewhere against revealing mysteries to those not prepared to receive them. Some scholars read the surviving fragments as describing an actual physical ritual involving paired initiates. Others read the entire sacrament as fundamentally internal and symbolic from the start, with the marriage language functioning purely metaphorically. What's notable is that every serious reading agrees on the underlying structure regardless of how literally or symbolically the specific ritual mechanics get interpreted. The goal, however it was physically enacted or not enacted, was recognition of an already existing wholeness, not the creation of something new. After the video on Thunder, Perfect Mind, several of you left comments connecting that text's refusal to sort itself into single categories with something you'd felt personally, that sense of containing contradictions you'd always been taught to resolve rather than simply hold. One comment in particular stayed with me. Someone describing a specific relationship they'd stayed in far longer than was healthy, convinced that leaving would mean losing the thing that made them feel whole, only to discover afterward that the sense of incompleteness followed them regardless, unchanged by the relationship's presence or absence. That's precisely the diagnostic the Gospel of Philip is making. If the wound is internal, the reunion has to be internal too, and no external arrangement, however genuinely valuable in its own right, can substitute for that internal work. This is where the text's warning about who the bridal chamber is not for becomes clearer. Not for animals, not for slaves, the text says, and I think the clearest reading of that language, once you strip away the archaic terminology, is this. The reunion isn't accessible to a consciousness still operating entirely from instinct and reactivity, still fully identified with appetite and impulse without any reflective distance from them. And it isn't accessible to a consciousness still fully bound to external authority for its sense of worth and direction, still waiting for permission from outside itself before it will recognize what it already is. Both of those states keep a person oriented entirely outward, looking for resolution somewhere other than the actual site of the division. The bridal chamber requires, as a precondition, exactly the kind of turning inward that we've traced through nearly every text on this channel, from the monad call material to Thunder's paradoxical self-claiming to the recognition work embedded in the Lord's Prayer once it's read correctly. There's a detail in Philip that I think gets overlooked because it's stated so plainly it almost slides past unnoticed. The text describes truth as not coming into the world naked, but coming clothed in types and images, and states that the world will not receive truth in any other way. That's a remarkably self-aware statement for an ancient religious text to make about its own methodology. The bridal chamber ritual, whatever its precise physical form, was never claiming to be a literal final description of the reunion it pointed toward. It was a type, an image, a physical enactment standing in for something that couldn't be directly transmitted in words or ritual gestures alone, only gestured toward, the way every text we've covered on this channel gestures toward gnosis without being able to simply hand it over directly. Recognition, by its nature in this entire tradition, has to happen inside the person experiencing it. No ritual, however carefully constructed, can perform that recognition on someone else's behalf. What this means practically, for anyone sitting with that background sense of incompleteness right now, is a genuinely different diagnostic than the ones modern culture typically offers. The feeling isn't necessarily evidence that you haven't yet found the right person, the right achievement, the right circumstance. According to this 2,000-year-old suppressed text, it might be evidence of something structurally older, a division the tradition traces back to the origin point of the material world itself, and the resolution the text points toward was never located outside you to begin with. It was always describing a reunion between who you currently experience yourself as and the fuller version of yourself that, in this cosmology, never actually left the pleroma at all, waiting this entire time for the recognition that would let the two rejoin. This doesn't mean the text is arguing against relationship, against partnership, against the genuine value of human connection. That would be a serious misreading. The Gospel of Philip treats earthly marriage with real respect, describing it explicitly as an image of the true bridal chamber rather than dismissing it as worthless. The point isn't that external relationship doesn't matter. It's that external relationship was never going to be sufficient on its own to resolve a division the tradition locates at a much deeper level. A person can have a genuinely loving, stable partnership and still carry the background hum of incompleteness, not because the partnership failed, but because it was addressing a different layer of the situation than the one actually producing the feeling. The text seems to be suggesting that both kinds of reunion matter, the external and the internal, but that only one of them was ever capable of fully resolving the specific ache so many people spend their entire lives trying to locate the source of. The desert kept this text too. One of the only surviving witnesses to an entire sacramental tradition, the institutional church made sure left almost no other trace anywhere in the historical record. No other complete description of what the highest Valentinian sacrament actually meant survived outside these damaged, indirect, deliberately careful pages. And maybe that carefulness is exactly the point. Some truths, the text itself seems to argue, were never meant to be handed over directly. They were only ever meant to be recognized from the inside by someone finally ready to stop looking for the missing half somewhere out there and turn instead toward the reunion that was always available exactly where they were standing. Consider, too, how strange it is that a ritual this central to an entire branch of early Christianity left almost no trace in the record its opponents preserved either. Irenaeus and other heresiologists we've discussed on previous videos wrote extensively against Valentinian teaching, cataloging what they considered dangerous or heretical, and yet even their hostile accounts give us only fragments of what the bridal chamber actually involved. That's unusual. Normally, the prosecutor's case, even when hostile, preserves at least a rough outline of what it's arguing against. Here, the silence is nearly total on both sides, the practitioner's own record damaged and incomplete, their opponent's record strangely thin on specifics. Whatever this sacrament actually was, it seems to have been considered too significant, or too dangerous, or perhaps too easily misused, if described carelessly, for anyone on either side of the conflict to leave behind a full and open account of it. If this video resonated with you, let me know by commenting, "I understood it."